come to these before, and being stuck to the computer for me is like a caged animal because I like to pace and walk around. And so I'll do my best to stay on screen, but if I get excited and seemingly jump through the screen, I apologize in advance. So again, thank you all for coming tonight or joining. Special thanks to Alex for organizing this. And I know she's done a lot in terms of communicating a lot of environmental issues here in Hampton Roads through the Botanical Garden and the adult education. So thank you to the garden for that. One of the issues that I like to talk about is where I come from. And I don't know if any of you, this is where I would say, anybody ever see a picture like this before, right? But I only see 5 of you at a time in the little black boxes. So it is what it is. This is called a field of corn, and it's a monument, I suppose, in Dublin, Ohio, near where I did my studies. And when I talk about the issue of climate change, in Ohio, this has relevance, right? It's corn. It's the Midwest, whatever the Midwest is. As a geography professor, I don't really know. But this really has no meaning to you, probably in Southeast Virginia by and large. Maybe some of you near Franklin or Central Virginia have interest in agriculture, but most of us here in Southside perhaps do not. But when I show images like this or stories like these on the left-hand side, this kind of highlights the issue of climate change and makes it real. I'm sorry? I saw something pop up in the chat, but I'm not really following that, so I apologize. Can you hear me? You're good? Okay, I'm just going to assume so.
We're good to go. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Alex. When I show images like this is much more kind of, it speaks to us, right? The infrastructure, the military bases threatened by sea level rise, 1,000 hospital admissions attributed to heat waves last summer. And so it kind of contextualizes the issue of climate change in the local context. So every presentation that I give, I like to start with a basic understanding of what weather and climate is, because they're often talked about in unison, but they're not really the same thing. I was talking to Alex before you all joined us, and today's temperature got to be 93 degrees. I wanted to tear my flesh off, really humid, right? And that's about normal for this time of year, right? About 90 degrees is our average July 14th maximum temperature. We've been warmer. In 1993, a major heat wave in which we've recorded 101 degrees, one of the dozen or so days we've been over 100 here in Southeast Virginia. And then we've also been relatively cool, 69 degrees, which I would take any day of the week in 1933, which ironically was a major hurricane that hit us and here in Hampton Roads, actually formed part of Willoughby Spit. So Dr. Marshall Shepard talks about weather is your mood, climate is your personality. And so the day-to-day weather, heat waves, an individual hurricane, a cold spell, is not really indicative of your personality, but instead your mood. So we're looking at long-term weather phenomena when we're talking about the issue of climate. And what we know is that the climate is warming, but it's not warming uniformly across space and or time. And the image on the left side there is from Dr. Jeremy Hoffman, who is at the Science Museum. He's the chief scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia. We've worked on some issues and he's given some of these talks as well. I think he's giving a talk later this summer or autumn. But we know that the Arctic is warming faster than the mid-latitudes. A variety of reasons for that I'll get into if you're interested. We know that most of the energy is actually going into the ocean. And so while we're setting heat records on the land, we're actually seeing about 80 or 90% of the energy being absorbed back into the ocean. So that creates a feedback mechanism in terms of marine ecosystems, in terms of potentially more catastrophic hurricanes and the like. And we also know that there's a spatial component, a temporal component, excuse me, as well, in terms of the seasonal variability. And the left image there, as I mentioned with Jeremy, is looking at Virginia. And we see across the Commonwealth, we have certain parts of our Commonwealth that are warming more rapidly than others. And we also have certain times of year in which our Commonwealth is warming differently in the case of winter in that top right diagram there. So the spatial and temporal variability. And statistics can tell you a lot of things, right? National Center for Environmental Information highlights that 20 of the 21 warmest years have occurred since the turn of the millennia. If you look at the last 10 years or so, you don't really see a lot of change, right? It's maybe a little bit of upward curve there, right? If you look at, since 1998, the major El Nino event of 98, you see a little bit of an upward, okay, maybe a little bit more indicative. And 98 is often used by the climate skeptics, excuse me, as some indicator that, 98 was really warmer, and we haven't really warmed since 1998. Well, we really have. But if you look at the long-term record, right, since the Industrial Revolution, we see a very different story. And so you can cherry pick data all you want, but the upward trend in terms of global land and sea surface temperature, so we're looking at all the buoys, all the thermometers, all the remote sensing tools that we have since the war, World War II in particular, led to a lot of innovation in meteorological instrumentation, for instance. And we can even look further back in terms of what CO2, a heat trapping gas, and how that heat trapping gas has changed over time. I'll talk about this in a minute in terms of paleoclimatology. And we have more CO2 in our atmosphere than any time in our previous history. And yes, we've had CO2 in the past over here, right? 150,000 years ago, but we weren't here. Our environment was very different during that time period. And so the implications of this are potentially serious. If you survey, this is from Neo Climate Communication, and they look at different spatial components. You can look at this statewide or congressional district-wide or national level. And they've done this this survey for a little bit over a decade now, I suppose. And in 2020, we surpassed 70% of people in the United States that said climate change is happening. This is like kind of like asking, do you believe in the Easter Bunny, right? Is it real or is it not real? I don't know. But when you ask, how many of those adults think global warming, climate change, when you use them interchangeably here, is mostly caused by humans, you see a very, very different map, right? Yes, climate change is happening, despite the political narratives. This is the general public saying this. But then when we say, what's the cause? We don't really know. But in reality, climate scientists, 98, 99% of climate scientists have attributed the heat trapping gases in our atmosphere leading to the changes that we've seen. I attribute this to going to see a doctor, a real doctor. I'm a doctor, but not kind that helps people, right? If you go to your cardiologist and they say you have cardiovascular disease or something, you might go see a second doctor, right? You're likely not going to go to 100 doctors and then take the advice of the 2 that says you don't have cardiovascular disease. Just keeping that in mind. And one of the challenges with the issue of climate change, as my blood pressure starts to ramp up as I would be pacing the room by now, is because this is the face of climate change, right? The polar bear, the cute, cuddly polar bear that holds Coca-Cola. And they've marketed Coca-Cola for decades around the polar bear. In reality, the polar bear really isn't that significant. Not that it's not important, but it's not that significant in terms of the ecosystem. Coral reefs, the dung beetle are much more valuable in terms of ecological productivity. And in reality, the polar bear will tear your flesh off and kill you. So it's, kind of a misnarrative with respect to the issue of climate change. And that's because of what I call the there and there problem. And many of you have probably seen on the news recently or read in the newspaper. I don't really know what a newspaper is anymore because everything's electronic, but I digress. But you've probably read about the wildfires in the West, right? Or the wildfires in Australia last year, right? And you think, oh, that's sad. That's their problem, meaning not here. Or you might read about Hurricane Harvey and say, oh, that's awful for those people in Houston. That's not here though, right? The there and their problem. And the challenge is, how do we humanize the impacts of climate change here and now? Because climate change is happening now, and it's impacting us in a variety of different ways, which is why I called tonight's presentation 757's Wicked Problem, because it's not a single problem. Climate change, the warming of our planet, is the problem, yes, but it impacts national security. It impacts agriculture. It impacts human health. It impacts your flood insurance rates for your house, right? And so it's tied to the economic, the political, the human health, the food system science that we have with respect to this wicked problem. So let's quickly run over. And so tonight's presentation is kind of let me wet your whistle. I'm not expecting you to pass a test after this by any means. I didn't have time to make a test. Alex told me I only had 3 hours, so I'm going to try to keep it to 3 hours. This is where people would laugh, and I would kind of thrive off that. But it's, again, I see 5 black screens. I'll just laugh at myself, I suppose. But my hope is that when you leave today a little bit more informed, that you take what you learn and you investigate it further. And so again, this is not meant to be a comprehensive dissertation on the issue of climate change, but to kind of inform you from a general layman public perspective of the science and the solutions regarding the issue. And so when we think about paleoclimatology, meaning old climate, we have a variety of ways in which we can measure old climate. And we probably did this as third graders, right? Look at tree rings and count the tree rings, and this tree is 400 years old. And oh, look, there's Jamestown during the drought because it's a different size of the tree ring. And so we can have some understanding of what the climate, what the environmental conditions were like when that tree was growing. Hi, Rochelle, I see a face. That's awesome, fantastic. By no means you have to put your camera on, so just saw a face pop up. Another example, besides tree rings. Tree rings are kind of limited, maybe 400-500 years, depending on where you are. Some trees are about 1,000 years old, but again, kind of limited in terms of a long-term life of Earth kind of climate. We also do what we call, we use ice cores, Greenland, Antarctica, right? We do sediment drilling. And some professors at Old Dominion University in oceanography do this. They go around the world and they drill through lake beds. They've done this in the Outer Banks to see where overwash has taken place. And we can better understand what, again, occurred long term. So you kind of pull out different characteristics, whether it be pollen, whether it be carbon dating. And we know that some of the carbon that we find in these tree rings and these ice cores, our origins come from fossil fuels because they contain what is called carbon-14. And carbon-14 is not in fossil fuels, and so it has to come from another source. And so we see a spike in carbon-16. We can differentiate between natural CO2 and human-induced CO2, burning of heat-trapping gases. So we can differentiate, again, not getting into the detailed science. Take a chemistry class if you want to learn more, we can chat, but I digress. So we put all those paleoclimatology records together, and what we get is this picture. And what we see is kind of oscillations and changes in climate. One of the fallacies is climate change has happened in the past. Yeah, I know, I studied this stuff, right? I know it's changed in the past, it's going to change in the future, but we have a fingerprint on it more so than ever before. Because these oscillations, these natural cycles, we cannot explain the observations that are taking place. We cannot explain only through these natural causes. So it has changed in the past, yes, but the rate of change is significantly different. And so that raises the question, what's different? I'm gonna have some water. Or vodka, you decide. One of these, Dr. Marshall Shepard at University of Georgia has a great TED Talk for those of you that are interested. It's called Climate Zombies. It's probably about 15 years old now, I suppose. But he goes through these different fallacies that we as climate scientists often hear. Right? It's natural, Dr. Allen. Yeah, no, it's not. It's the sunspot cycle. Like, no, that's 7 years. We know this, right? We need more evidence. Yeah, you said the same thing about smoking in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s before any policymakers did anything about smoking. The science was pretty clear about smoking. It will kill you. And yet we gave cigarettes to military personnel. I digress. So if you're interested, the climate zombies. What we see here is, so kind of walking through these zombies in some way, we see the observation of temperature, right? Okay, it's warming, fantastic, great. Well, not fantastic, but you get the point. We know that volcanoes play an important role. Major volcanic eruptions block incoming solar radiation. If they're blocking incoming solar radiation, what happens to the temperature where you and I live? It goes down because you're blocking incoming solar. It's like clouds, right? When you have clouds, it's a little bit cooler. I wish we had some more clouds. And so you see these Pinatubo, Tambora, and the like in the long-term climate record. Short oscillations, relatively short-lived, dips in global temperature. The sun, right? This is, again, those fallacies. The sun gives us 7-11-year cycles. And so, yes, the sun plays a role, but it's a short time period. Scale matters. Or we call Milankovitch cycles. As you spin a top, what happens? It slows down, it begins to wobble, right? And the same thing happens with us on our axis. We change the rotation around the sun is not perfectly circular. We change the axis speed at which so again, these Milankovitch cycles play a role in long-term climate variability, but by and large, not major influencers. Orbital change, that's the Milankovitch cycle, great. Natural climate change variability, you put all those things together I just mentioned, and there you get the gray box, gray line. It doesn't explain the observed warming. Okay, so what's happening? Well, what's happening is aerosols Again, blocking incoming radiation, whether that's stuff you're spraying in your hair or refrigerants or CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, things of that sort. Ozone is not related to climate change, but it plays a role in how energy is dispersed over the surface of the Earth. So there's an impact of ozone there, but again, not significantly important in the grand scheme of things. And then deforestation, right? And so you put those together and you still have something like it's not aligning. And that's because we're missing the major driver of the anthropogenic climate change, and that's heat trapping gases. Yes, the heat trapping gases, the greenhouse effect is natural. Without the greenhouse effect, we would not be here. We would freeze to death. So the greenhouse effect is good, but we basically turn the knob on the greenhouse effect by increasing our emissions through fossil fuels, burning of natural gas and the like. And so what we see is that we've actually overcompensated of the warming of the planet by using fossil fuels. Scale matters, geography matters. As a geography professor, that's one thing I really try to teach my students, is that CO2 is the major culprit because it remains in the atmosphere for a very long time, decades. Methane gas, clean energy, I'm using air quotes around that for those of you that aren't watching the screen. Clean energy, you see the trucks driving around, clean energy, natural gas, methane. Yeah, it's cleaner than your toilet, but it's still a fossil fuel. It's still a heat trapping gas, and that heat trapping gas is much more potent than carbon dioxide. Fortunately, it doesn't stay in the atmosphere nearly as long. And the complexity of this issue is drawn there on the right-hand side, and this is from the EPA, drawing your attention to the different sources of these heat trapping gases. Yes, it's electricity. Yes, it's transportation. Yes, it's agriculture. Yes, it's transportation. Yes, it's a variety of other processes. China is often brought up, but China, right? Yeah, China emits a lot of greenhouse gases, but they also have 5 times the population. And so if you look at per capita fossil fuel emissions, the United States and Australia really lead the world, Canada, really lead the world in terms of how much fossil fuel use we use per person. Some estimates say that if everybody on the planet, all 1.758 or so billion of us, right? If we all lived as we do here in the United States in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions, we would need 4 Earths. The amount of water we use, the amount of energy that we consume, and the like. So when we think about the issue of climate change, scale and place matters. I already mentioned heat trapping gases are overcompensating, so we're actually warming. And so if you put all those human factors together, the heat trapping gases, deforestation, the natural processes and the like, and you get a pretty good picture of what's going on in terms of global land and sea surface temperature. The National Climate Assessment states, and I think this is pretty profound, and this is one of the challenges in communicating climate science, is you've probably never heard this, right? Over the last century, there's no conceiving alternative explanation. The scientists cannot explain the observed warming of our planet without taking into account fossil fuels, right? That's pretty clear. It doesn't get any more clear than that, and they are redoing the National Climate Assessment forthcoming now, and that will be released in the near future. So it's different. As I mentioned already earlier, we've had more CO. We've been warmer in the past, yes, but we weren't here. The rate of change is what is significant. We have undergone in the last 150 years, plus or minus, since the Industrial Revolution, since we decided to start burning fossil fuels. And that has led to a variety of improvements of quality of life and the like. So we're not criticizing that aspect of it, but how do we think about the impacts, the implications of that decision? We have gone the same in the last 150 years. We've warmed the same as we did in the preceding glaciation period. We have a large ice sheet situated to our north that actually etched out parts of the Chesapeake Bay as it melted off. As that melted off, that was the same amount of warming that took place over 10,000 years as we've done in the last 150 years. The scale is significantly different. And the challenge with respect to communicating the issue of climate, when I talk about climate change, as soon as I say climate change, anywhere, churches, hospitals, I never talked to the hospital, that'd be weird. Schools, my students, I say climate change and everybody's like, oh God, I wanna like vomit. I don't wanna talk about the issue of climate change. I love talking about the issue of climate change because it impacts everything, right? But one of the challenges is it's a clouded narrative. And some of the notorious clouders are highlighted there on the right. A great book and video, Merchants of Doubt, highlights the discourses starting with smoking and acid rain and even fire retardants of what goes into science and how the scientific narrative is clouded by a bunch of PR experts that are paid by the Koch brothers or Americans for Prosperity or front organizations, right? And so they draw attention to this issue of climate change. So we don't really know. Well, who is we? You might not know, but the climate scientists, right? The cardiovascular surgeons that you went to see about your cardiovascular disease, they know, right? I trust the scientists, not the PR experts. And this is going to play, and I want it to play it. Okay, there we go. So 757's problem, we can think about this in a variety of issues. We can think about this in terms of scale. Tangier Island, anybody been to Tangier? They've been there twice. It's in the Chesapeake Bay. They will likely become some of the first Virginia climate refugees. Not because of sea level rise necessarily, but because of saltwater intrusion and the inability to flush their toilets and have potable water. If you think about this in Hampton Roads, the 7 cities, or Virginia, or the United States, or this little blue marble that Carl Sagan highlights, right? Or we can think about this across sectors: human health, phenology, meaning plants, biodiversity, economy, national security, or the like. And so again, as I run through this, kind of think about these different layers, and you might be interested in agriculture much more than you're interested in national security, or vice versa, right? And so I encourage you, I'm happy to share this and or any of the resources that I've highlighted. What we see with climate change, warming of our planet, is a shift in the means and the extremes. Not only is average temperature warming, but the extremes are becoming a little bit more common. Heat waves being the most, right? Heat waves today are very different than they were in the 1970s. We've seen nearly doubling of the heat wave days here in Southeast Virginia, and I know that because I published on it. So we see this shiftward on the right trajectory. Yeah, we still have cold. Ask Texas in February, right? We still have cold, but it's much less common and much less severe. The problem with Texas was not because it was cold. It was because of the lack of infrastructure, and then the windmills froze or something. I forget exactly what happened, but you get the point. That was a joke. The windmills didn't freeze. They have windmills much colder locations. The health professionals, the people that are experts like the MDs, right? They call climate change a medical emergency. And I use the analogy, if I'm hiking in the woods and a tree falls on my leg and I'm bleeding out of an artery, that's an emergency, because if I don't get care immediately, I'm going to bleed out. I can bandage it all day, but I'm not an expert to fix this bleeding artery. It's an emergency. And there's a variety of impacts, some of which are more local than others. We're probably not as much interested in Rift Valley fever here in Southeast Virginia as we are of diseases that are carried by other vectors like mosquitoes. And if you change the habitat, you warm the environment, you have the potential for these new diseases to be transmitted. Respiratory infections, heat waves, forced migration, and the like. Medical emergency. You've probably heard of the Chicago heat wave of '95, or the European heat wave of 2003, in which 60,000 people died, or the 2010 India or 2016 Russia, which or most recently, right, Oregon last week, over 100 people succumbed to heat because of the lack of infrastructure. You don't have air conditioning in the Pacific Northwest because the average temperature is like 75. Why would you ever expect 109 or whatever it was? So the human stories, they actually ran out of room in the morgue in the Chicago heat wave of '95 to store bodies in a developed, right, air quotes, developed advanced society. And so these heat waves have become longer lasting, earlier occurring, and more frequent as the warming planet has taken place. This is a recent example here, and you're probably like, what are you showing? Change the color background and whatnot. This is actually looking at remote sensing imagery. So here we are here in Norfolk, or Washington, D.C., or West Virginia, which is where I was born. Take me home. And the colors indicate higher or poor air quality, basically. And this air quality is a function of the wildfires from the west. Because I hate to break it to you, air moves. And so if you have wildfires in the Pacific Northwest, that air is moving, we live in the westerlies, from west to east, and eventually impact. That's why we had some really nice sunsets last week. That's also why maybe some of you had problems breathing last week, because that particulate matter was suspended in the atmosphere and you're breathing it or blowing out of your nose or what have you. The great thing about masks, with COVID, a different story here is I can wear that mask all the time when I mow grass because pollen is a problem for me living here in Southeast Virginia. So wildfires, there's a connection to a warming climate in here in Southeast Virginia in terms of air quality and human health. Many people say it's only a degree. I'm going to start running through this because this is kind of like wham, bam, quick examples here. If you get a degree, a fever of 101, 102 degrees, what happens? You're going to see a doctor. You're probably going to go to the ER. So 1 or 2 degrees makes a big difference for us as humans, let alone for a marine ecosystem, or let alone for a mosquito, right? Mosquitoes are going to find that warm body to suck the blood out of, right? So a degree or two makes a significant difference. What we've seen is not only increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, but as a consequence, we've seen a modification of the marine ecosystem, the pH. And the pH is important for things like calcium formation for oysters or shellfish or the like. We've also seen the influx of algae blooms in the Chesapeake Bay tied to heavy rain events. This is a major issue for the Department of Health. I like food. Who doesn't like food though, right? I like beer. So you like to eat or drink or vodka or bottled water, what have you, right? Climate is impacting your food. The NOAA Climate has some great resources there. I love the one on the bottom left. There's Climate and French Fries, about how climate change is impacting the potato industry, both here in the US and around the world. And if you've never seen the image on the right-hand side, this is the Agalawa Aquifer that extends from Nebraska down through the panhandle of Texas. This is where we get a bunch of our water to grow a bunch of our food for our cows, chickens, and pigs, and also where we have a lot of cows, chickens, and pigs. Because the breadbasket of America actually doesn't grow food, it grows fuel for our cars and feed for our animals. Much of the corn that we grow in the Midwest is actually modified, so we actually there's no very limited nutritional value. Instead, it's fed to the agricultural system. And so what we're pumping out of the aquifers is not being replenished in the same amount of time. That's in the Midwest. Let's bring it a little bit more local at home. The Yorktown Aquifer. This is the aquifer that extends up the eastern shore. This is also with a SWIFT facility in Suffolk, the Sustainable Water Initiative for Tomorrow. They're pumping fecal water that they've cleaned and blasted with UV light like a fish tank. Anybody ever hear of the SWIFT facility? You go get a free tour of it over in Suffolk. But they're taking that wastewater and they're injecting it back into the groundwater system to reduce our land subsidence, because we're also sinking here in Southeast Virginia. And so if we can reduce land subsidence, the sea level rise potentially won't be as catastrophic. Concern with the water system also on the eastern shore for things like ghost forests that you see there on the right, saltwater intrusion, forests like water, but they don't like salt water, right? Just like you and I don't like salt water. And then a major concern on the northern neck, middle peninsula, and eastern shore. And even if you think about the Outer Banks, is the septic systems. Where are they? What happens when it gets really hot in terms of their functionality? What happens when you have water that overwashes into these septic systems? Where does that water go? What is in that water? Let's not talk about it, but you can think about it. This is a quote from a student a couple years ago. She said, "I'm so ready for summer, but it's like we never had a winter this year." I can relate. Here we go. Oh, I don't know why I skipped that. What we're seeing, some of the research I published in the International Journal of Climatology, is that our seasons are changing, which sounds great, right? Sit by the beach longer in the summer. But if you change the seasons, right, you're also extending the hurricane season. If you change the seasons in terms of the energy being absorbed by the ocean or the land or what have you, you change the habitat of species like insects. You change the bloom dates for flowers that my bees rely upon. And so if you have a phenological mismatch of bloom dates take place, but there's not enough bees to go get or there's not enough food for the bees, right? That's a problem. We rely on bees. I have 150,000 of them in my backyard. 1/3 of everything we eat comes from a honeybee, which is not native to North America, but that's another story that Alex can talk about later, I suppose. The Department of Defense calls climate change a threat multiplier. Now, if I talk about the Department of Defense in Northeast Ohio, they're just going to roll their eyes at me, right? They want to know about the Great Lakes. what's happening in the Great Lakes or agriculture, as I mentioned earlier with the field of corn. But there's some quotes there, some stories if you're interested in learning more about the issue of climate change. And the Department of Defense and the US military recognize climate change not only as a threat multiplier, but a potential for instability to be enhanced, right? As Rear Admiral David Tilley, who's a professor at Penn State University, former head of the Center for Climate and Security, once said, he said, it makes bad places worse. It's like adding an ace to a deck of cards, right? You're going to draw an ace, but the probability has increased of drawing that ace. If you have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 aces in there, right? You increase the probability of drawing those extreme examples. Here locally, maybe you've seen the story in the headlines the last couple of days of the moon wobble forthcoming. I read that story. I'm like, what? I didn't know the moon wobble. I didn't know the moon wobbled. I'm not a geophysicist or a moon scholar. I like to moonwalk, I suppose. But anyways, the story highlights that as the Earth wobbles, as I mentioned earlier, the same thing's happening with other gravitational forces like the moon. And so the research suggests that in the near future, because of the gravitational pull of the moon, excuse me, our flooding will become more frequent and more severe. This is not thinking about heavy rain events. This is not thinking about hurricane storm surge. This is not thinking about us subsiding. This is not thinking about sea level rise. This is purely a function of the moon. So I say we just go blow the moon up and we'd be perfectly fine in terms of flooding. I'm just kidding. We're not gonna do that. We'll leave the space exploration to the billionaires. Here in Southeast Virginia, in the last 100 years or so, we've had 15 inches of sea level rise. So as you drive around, which I hope you're not driving through water, turn around, don't drown. As you drive and you see flooded roadways, you can imagine that water did not exist 100 years ago because 15 inches of water would be, right? Excuse me. As I mentioned earlier, most of the energy is going into the ocean. And climate change does not cause heat waves. Heat waves occur anyways, right? Climate change does not cause hurricanes, right? Hurricanes are a function of warm water, yes. If you warm the water more, you increase the probability, but you're not causing hurricanes. There's a variety of other factors that go into causing hurricanes. But here in Southeast Virginia, we're looking at not a couple of inches of sea level rise. We're talking about potentially feet or meters, particularly as we think about the intersections with the ice sheets that exist in the poles and the instability of those ice sheets, and if and when they melt. So this is a great resource here. You can Google it if you're interested. I'm going to run through 3 iterations. This is from NOAA. It's called a Sea Level Rise Viewer. And there's a variety of other resources like this online, but I think this is user-friendly, showing Southeast Virginia. Okay, this is not designed to predict flooding at your house, so keep that in mind. It's just drawing attention to what would happen if we had a foot of sea level rise. Okay, what would happen if, right? You can see some of the rivers, particularly in Southeast Virginia Beach, Back Bay area. What happens if we have 2 feet of sea level rise? Right? Pungo, some of the communities that already have flooding concerns are literally underwater in that case. Not even 2 feet, we're talking about 1 foot. They're underwater, right? What happens at 3 feet? Right? How do we here in coastal Virginia, and this is not a Virginia problem, right? Charleston, West Virginia, Miami, Florida, Boston, Massachusetts, San Francisco, right? Shanghai, you might have heard of it, right? Bangladesh, the country of Bangladesh is at sea level. So this is not a there or a there problem. This is a us and here and a now problem, right? Dr. Tom Allen, we're not related, it's called the Blue Line Project, maybe 2 years ago now, and he took students out in geography, his coastal geography course or marine geography, I forget what class it was exactly, and he used drone mapping to map high tide, as you see here in the blue, the today line, right? This is the Chrysler Museum, for those of you that are unfamiliar. Ironically, there was an old creek bed that ran right through the center of Chrysler, which is one reason why that part of town floods, but that's another story for another time. And what they did is they then modeled out what that landscape would look like with sea level rise iterations by 2050. This is mean high tide. This isn't storm surge. This isn't a heavy rain. This is just normal high tide. By 2100, a friend of mine just had a baby. This is his baby will be 80 years old in 2100. So they will have water that extends all the way around and goes off the map here. Just at mean high tide. This isn't storm surge. Again, thinking about the implications of climate change. Potentially catastrophic for your home, for your insurance, for your health, wealth, and well-being. We're talking about billion-dollar disasters in 2020. We had 22 of them. We had 7 major hurricanes. Maybe you remember Isaias. It's not a major hurricane, but certainly led to devastation in the North Carolina coast and parts of Southeast Virginia. Or Hurricane Delta, they actually ran out of letters, if you recall, last year. And we've already had Elsa last week. It was a tropical storm. One point of clarification. I'm almost done, I promise. One point of clarification. Many people say, we were last hit by a major hurricane here in Southeast Virginia in 2011 with Hurricane Isabel, Irene. I get them mixed up, right? Hurricane Isabel was nothing. It's a low category 1 when it hit us. And many of you maybe remember the devastation that we saw. The last time Hampton Roads was hit by a major category 3 or above hurricane was 1933, and it formed Willoughby Spit. Not if, but when are we prepared and resilient in the face of these disasters? Billion-dollar disasters, from wildfires to heavy rain to severe weather to heat waves and the like. And so it raises not only scientific questions. A former dean once said that the science is easy, right? I usually have a ball. Here it is. I have a globe, right? Science is easy. Look, gravity, it's easy. 32 feet per second, 9.8 meters per second, it's science, right? When we talk about the human systems, that becomes much more complex. Behavior, economic, political decision-making, or lack thereof. And Tangier Island is a great example of that. This is a story from the New York Times a couple of years ago of raising a really important ethical, environmental, economic Virginia question. Should the United States save Tangier from the oblivion? You can say yes, no, left, right, up, down, I don't really care. But then you can replace Tangier Island and say Hampton Roads. Replace Tangier Island and say the Commonwealth of Virginia in terms of, or California, right? The 5th largest economy in the world, not the United States, in the world. Questions? So, kind of hopeless. No, it's not hopeless because we know how to solve it. It's like, how do we stop lung cancer? One way is not smoking, right? That's one way. Now there's a variety of barriers to that. Okay, fine, but we know the solutions because we know the causes. This is one solution to addressing climate change, and this is not in Hampton Roads. I couldn't find the picture last minute to put the one on Hampton Boulevard or the 20 on Hampton Boulevard that exists now of raising the houses. This is a way we can be resilient. Although your car still floods, the road still floods. If you're elderly, you're probably not going to climb up the 25 stairs. If your power's out, your elevator might not work, right? This is kind of putting a Band-Aid on a bleeding artery. It doesn't do anything for resilience. It's important, but it doesn't address or solve the climate crisis. There are a variety of solutions from individual, right? Bike more, drive less. Okay, that's simple. But it's also larger systematic global issues, right? Why do we not have solar here in Virginia? I love showing the bottom left map. This is a little bit old now from EIA. And my students, I would always draw your attention to North Carolina and Virginia. And I said, why in the world is North Carolina covered in solar panels? You drive over the border and you see solar panels everywhere. Same with Delaware. And then you get back into Virginia, you're like, it's sunny here. It's windy here. Now we've moved in terms of some of these larger systematic concerns with wind power, but it's connected to Dominion, a whole other discussion. We can think about local ordinances. In Norfolk, we just passed maybe a year or two now, I guess. Local ordinances that require builders to incorporate flood planning in what they do on site. Well-intentioned. One of the challenges with this is Norfolk is very urbanized already, and so that doesn't really do anything for housing that already exists here. And you can see this taking place if you're down driving Llewellyn, where it floods all the time, and you look to the right where the old JEB school is, and they're turning into apartments. Some of you may be familiar with that. They put a large culvert in there to hold water and fine. But that's in a flood zone. And we're still building in these flood zones. So I digress. And most recently, the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act incorporated climate change into the state policy to address aspects of the Clean Water Act in the Chesapeake Bay, and required the different states and commonwealths to consider the issue of climate change. Lastly, a great TED Talk, for those of you that are interested, Chris Fleischer, his TED Talk is called, what's it called, Mike? Oh, Project Drawdown. There it is, right in front of me. I can read. And he highlights 80 solutions. And I'm always amazed at the surprise faces when we talk about refrigeration as a climate solution, or we talk about agriculture, sustainable agriculture, local food production as a climate solution, or we talk about managed grazing. Maybe some of these won't relate to us here in Hampton Roads, fine. But there are dozens and dozens of different solutions, both individually, community, as well as globally. And they're taking place whether we like it or not. The left image there is from the Uluru Islands, which is in Lake Titicaca in Peru. This is a study abroad I led a couple years ago, in which all the floating reed islands have solar panels to charge their phones and their cooking equipment and alike. And that's because the government said, here, we need your well-being to be safe, because if you have kerosene on a floating reed island and it catches on fire, that's not good for your well-being, because the reed island sinks. And so they invested in these solar panels. For you and I to invest in solar, it's between $20,000 and $40,000 here in Southeast Virginia. Why? Well, it's because of the larger economic political structures that exist in terms of fossil fuels and the subsidies or the payments that we provide to these fossil fuel companies. And BP is great with this, right? After BP Horizon oil spill, they had a PR expert come in, they changed their logo, they changed their design, they changed their colors, all to save face with respect to the BP, because people weren't going to BP, right? They're going to Exxon or something, not realizing that many of these corporations are all intertwined. And so if, $100 billion a year going to support fossil fuels, can we take some of that and also support the energy of the future to provide clean air and the like? Again, more locally here, this is one solution perhaps that the city of Norfolk is proposing, is to build a large seawall at the mouth of the Elizabeth River to quote unquote protect Norfolk, drawing on some of the Dutch engineering that exists or has come to the Southeast Virginia in the last decade or so. But there are certainly ecological ramifications. There are certainly equity concerns. There are certainly economic concerns, right? The $1.8 billion price tag for the seawall. Scale that to all the other cities I mentioned in the United States. Is this the solution? Miami just recently passed a referendum of a bond to raise roads, improve their water infrastructure and the like. But Miami, again, is sitting at sea level. We're talking about billions of dollars of assets on the Florida coast that are standing at risk of sea level rise, but also major hurricanes or land subsidence due to karst or lack of government oversight due to building infrastructure concerns. I digress. So takeaway, climate change is real. Yeah, we know. Humans are the primary cause. Yeah. The impacts, whether it's health, economics, national security, food, my honeybees, are potentially catastrophic. And we can adapt all day and night. We can raise homes, we can raise roads, bridges, tunnels, what have you. But without mitigating the causes, that being heat trapping gases going into the atmosphere at every scale, as I wrote in the pilot about 5 years ago, at every scale and every sector immediately, we're not really going to mitigate the impacts of climate change. We have to mitigate the causes. You have to stop smoking in order to not get lung cancer, right? So with that, I'm happy to have a discussion. There's my Twitter, there's my email, there's a picture from Idaho, not Norfolk. And with that, I welcome back Alex, I suppose, and I'll drink some water. Thank you again. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thank you for the phenomenal presentation, really. We do have some questions here that I'll read out loud. So the first one, could Dr. Allen discuss the lag time between atmospheric CO2 levels and global temperature increases. So said differently, if humankind stopped production of every single greenhouse gas today, how much more warming would
I don't
we
give
expect?
numbers. That's a great question. So one of the challenges is, and I don't know who asked that, so thank you whoever asked that. I'm not going to open the chat because it gives me anxiety, so I'm just going to keep talking. One of the challenges is, yes, we also need to capture and store and sequester carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that requires not only natural solutions like trees, but also industry and innovation to do so. If we stopped production of heat trapping gases today, we're still on a trajectory because that CO2 and methane is still absorbing outgoing long wave radiation. Okay. And so how to bend that curve requires us to stop greenhouse gas emissions immediately, as well as reverse, if you will, that process of accentuated greenhouse effect, excuse me. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you for that. And let's see, the next one we have from Abigail. She wants to know what you would say is the largest man-made cause of climate change. For example, she listed cow farms, transportation, companies, etc.
There's it's a Bloomberg, I think, maybe 2 years ago, highlighted the big five. The big five companies that are the dominant emitters. Right, you and I were part of this, yes. But if you look at the larger discourse, scale matters. So Chevron, BP, right, the big fossil fuel companies, they emit more than most countries emit. So yes, agriculture plays a role. Yes, transportation systems here in Virginia. Virginia's transportation system is a major driver here in the Commonwealth. I know Jeremy Hopp at the Science Museum has been working with some of that issue in terms of transportation systems. And yes, that, biking infrastructure, okay, fine, but also how do we design our cities to allow for mobility? Because our cities are designed for cars, not people. And I can say that as an avid cyclist biking Hampton Boulevard, which has a speed limit of 30 miles an hour. It's a 6-lane road, and the speed limit is 30 miles an hour. There's nobody that goes 30 miles an hour. So there's nobody going to bike that road except me at 5 o'clock in the morning.
Thank you. So we have another question here. Wondering if you could elaborate. There's a slide, it said as one of the solutions would be educating girls. If you could just elaborate on that.
Yeah, great. Whoever picked up on that is really paying attention. And this TED Talk goes into much more detail on that issue. And he goes, that's one of the issues that he picks out because it's a surprise. And the idea behind educating women is if you educate women, as we've done in many parts of the world, that has led to lower birth rates, that has led to family planning in terms of how and when and if to have children, how many children to have. That has also led to the women being innovators and business entrepreneurs to solve not only the climate crisis, but also other. And it's not only educating girls in this context that he highlights, Chris does in this TED Talk, it's educating women, but it's also enhancing climate literacy more broadly, which is why I enjoy giving these research talks or these talks to the general public. Again, churches, not hospitals, schools, what have you, is our scientific literacy here in the United States is very, very low. And our understanding of climate is even lower than that because most of us probably weren't taught climate. Most of us are K-12 educators, and I work with the Virginia Geographic Alliance, which works with the K-12, K-16 education curriculum in the Commonwealth of Virginia to improve climate and geographic education. We don't train our K-12 educators to talk about the issue of climate change. Or in some cases, some states, I won't name any, Georgia, but they actually outlaw the use of talking about climate change in their educational curriculum. How can we talk about, again, back to the smoking, right? You can't say smoking causes cancer because then that might actually make you think. Alex.
Yep, no, thank you for that. So I was reading through the chat here. We've got a few more things. I will say there are a lot of direct messages where they appreciate your enthusiasm and humor. That definitely goes a long way in some of communication.
Who are these people? Hold on, let me see.
So we have another question. In your opinion, which industry is leading the movement towards climate or towards changing in a positive direction?
Mm. It's hard to answer questions like that because there's a lot of local efforts. I'm on the board for Wetlands Watch, and they're working closely with policymakers. Skip Stiles and his team are working closely with the General Assembly in terms of not necessarily contextualizing climate, but also like flood resilience. How do we address flooding here in Southeast Virginia and the Commonwealth more broadly? Virginia did just get into the RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, recently. And so there's now funds, something like $25 million this year alone, that funds that are going into resilience projects in the Commonwealth. You know, and many of these hopefully go towards communities that don't have the capacity to quote unquote be resilient. Places like Matthews, Virginia, that doesn't have the economic capacity to move their entire town upstream. And so I pause with answering what organizations are doing good jobs. I would say there are great examples of locally, Elizabeth River Project, even in terms of education on some of these issues, right? Other nonprofits. Also in the Commonwealth, there's Old Dominion has this Commonwealth Center for Reoccurrent Flooding Resilience or something like that, CCRFR. So there's state agencies involved in this. Ann Phillips in the governor's office is engaged in these discourses in terms of developing a master plan for coastal Virginia in the face of resilience. And so there's a lot of movement in that regard. And then nationally, you look at parts of Texas, they lead the country in wind energy. This is not a Republican or Democrat issue, because what you find is that, and her name is Catherine Hayhoe at Texas Tech University, who's now, I believe, the chief scientist for Nature Conservancy, if I'm not mistaken. But she highlights parts of Northwest Texas, the Panhandle, as being some of the reddest Republican areas in the U.S., and yet they have windmills because they've disconnected from the economic structure and the government, if you will, and so it's allowed free market, if you will, to thrive. And so, you know, how do you cross those barriers and talk to people rather than science isn't political, right? Sea level rises, whether you're Republican or Democrat, left, right, up, down. But the challenge of that is difficult, as we're learning with COVID and others. The political forces are challenging. I've stopped, sorry to tangent on that for a second, I suppose, but I've stopped. Do you believe in climate change? I believe in Santa Claus the same way, right? I don't care what you believe. They still hold the Flat Earth Society meeting every year in Denver. So, you know, they believe that the Earth is flat. Is it not? I don't know. I digress. Alex.
Thank you for that. So we have a few more comments here I'll read through as we're getting towards the end of our time. So this one I'll read through. Dean wants to know, what can we do? Mitigation, in his opinion, is best done by governments, industries, and corporations. Adaptation is something that will be forced upon us. Should we focus on organizing to affect global changes, personal behavior changes? And then they do say it feels hopeless, but I will say on that note real quick, it's not, because there's people like you tuning in. So there is some hope in that aspect. You know, there's people willing to make changes like yourself there.
Yeah, great question and good observation as well. I think the wave has shifted. The sails have shifted, if you will. The Yale climate communication maps a decade ago or more, only 40% of the U.S. populace said climate change was happening. But more recently, particularly in the last 5 years with hurricanes, wildfires, the role of mass media, you think about what's going on in places like Australia and the like, we've become, if you turn on the news, NPR this morning, they had 3 stories on climate change or climate related impacts. Because when it impacts me, it becomes an issue that I don't care what I believe. It's about me at this point, the them and their discussion. So organizing certainly is a way to enact change locally, statewide, globally. I would say I would challenge the idea that it feels hopeless. I can understand that sentiment in some way, but I also I try to lead by example. Not perfect by any means, but I hope that when I tell my students I bike to campus, they're like, huh, that guy's crazy. I bet I could do that Or I tell them, I only eat meat once a week. Like, huh, I could probably do that if I knew how to cook or, you know, what have you. Some of the barriers, once informed, can be brought down, because the barriers really aren't rooted in reality in many cases. Again, the Uluru Islands have solar panels. Why don't we have solar panels everywhere? We have these ugly power lines. Why can't we put a little solar panel on top of it? Or a wind vane, right? Depending on where you are, you know. If we can transport coal from Appalachia down Norfolk Southern and pollute Lambert's Point, we can do the same thing with solar.
Thank you for that. On that note, we do have another question if you're able to talk to it.
I have all night, Alex. I know you don't. But
they want to know what the state of technology is for moving greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. It says that seems to be one technological solution with the most impact. Are you able to comment on that?
Not much. I would say it exists, but the scale, it's kind of like a personal dilemma here. It's like, we're going to the moon. We're going to explore the moon. Well, why don't we fix the problems here before going to another planet and destroying that place? Again, that's maybe a personal comment on that regard. But sucking CO2 doesn't, like, that's a part of it. But why don't we just stop emitting CO2? The technology exists, so why don't we can do both. But in terms of exactly where that technology is, it exists, yes, but not to the scale and magnitude. And Dr. Michael Mann had a 60 Minutes episode maybe 6 or 8 months ago that highlighted some of that technology. I'm sure you can find that online to learn more on that topic. I wouldn't be able to speak too much beyond what I just said.
So we do have time for one more here. I see the first part of the question we'll address, and then we'll see if we have time for the rest. But we have from Kara, she says that a plant-rich diet is a big piece of that pie chart. Can you remind us or highlight why that is and why you think we don't hear about that more?
You want my honest opinion or no? We don't hear about that more because we think, and I'm saying we as in the Western diet, we think that protein only comes from meat products. In reality, protein comes from other things that meat products eat. I have a great lab exercise for my class. It's a water exercise in which they calculate how much water input goes into making this t-shirt, or how much fossil fuels go into taking the water from your faucet and flushing a toilet or what have you, right? So it's kind of a energy balance, earth balance, water balance assessment of their personal, and then they scale that to Old Dominion University. Like, scale matters, right? Individually, how many water bottles do you drink in a day? If we all did that, how many water bottles would that be? Where does that go? Okay, so back to the plant-rich diet. One of the aspects of that is, for every pound of beef, think about a cow, how massive a cow. I'm amazed at how many of my students have never seen a cow, by the way, but that's, again, another story for another class. But you look at a cow and it's massive. And a pound of beef, to make that pound of beef, that cow has to eat. And that cow has to drink a crap ton of that food that we grow in the breadbasket of America. The corn, the wheat, the whatever, right? And so that cow and the multiple stomachs and the way the cow forms, blah, 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 or the chicken on the Eastern Shore, right, in the dead of summer, the smell that you smell, right? The inputs into that chicken or cow are significantly greater than if you would just eat all of the spinach in my backyard. And you would be full, and you would have more protein and less fat and less cholesterol and less water input and less carbon dioxide input than if you would go to 80-20. And I ate a burger there the other day. Okay, fine. But again, if you can reduce that meat consumption, you can certainly play an important role. And again, back to the Western diet, most of us in the Western diet are dying of things like cardiovascular disease, heart disease, potentially even cancer has been related to the diets that we have and the lack of activity that we have. And that's gone because of the way that we've transitioned, and most of us sit on our rear ends and sit in front of a computer, and okay, that is what it is. But how do we change that discourse? What was the second part of that question? I love talking about food, by the way, because I like food.
So once reading it, it was kind of more, asking why they didn't hear about that more. And then they go on to say it's always about electric cars, clean versus dirty energy, and et cetera. Those being things that most people can't afford or actually affect on a daily basis. Whereas, eating more vegetables might be a more approachable step.
Yeah, it's an approachable step. And I would also challenge the idea of why electric is more expensive. Why is it more? That we have the sun, right? We have more solar energy coming in on the surface of the earth than all the coal that we've ever burned in the history of humankind. But that's a bigger question. Why is it more expensive? It's not because it is more expensive. It's because of a lack of investment from the political and economic structures. I already showed you the Uluru Islands. They all have solar panels. Why is it $80,000 or 50, whatever it is for a Tesla, for instance, right?
Well, with that, we are past our time. I really do want to thank you for such a wonderful presentation. Not only was it incredibly informative, but it was engaging, and you took, a very large, sometimes, very complex topic and made it very not only engaging, like I said, but digestible. It really covered a lot of ground, and we appreciate that so much. With everyone that's still tuned in, we will be sending resources out to you all to whatever email that you received this Zoom link through. And please stay tuned throughout the summer and fall for more programs, free Zoom programs that support this message and our Wash the Short exhibit. So thank you guys for tuning in. Huge thank you to Dr. Allen for presenting tonight. And with that, hopefully we see you guys at the garden.
Thanks, Alex. Be well. Cheers.